So over to you, Paloma.
On behalf of the Center Directors section of the Latin American Studies Association, LASA, I'm delighted to open this event, which is part of our section's monthly series on indigeneity, Afro-descendants, and other marginalized populations in Latin America. The series encourages transcontinental collaborations, especially between the Global South and North, and it seeks to feature scholars, activists, experts, and others from groups historically marginalized in Latin America. We are delighted with the response of many centers of Latin American studies that have volunteered to organize these talks. In fact, we have so many proposals that we may extend this series until next academic year. Today, we thank our host, Dr. Stephen Wilkinson, Director of the International Institute for the Study of Cuba at the University of Buckingham, and Dr. Marta Carminero-Santangelo, former Director of the University of Kansas Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. Both centers have partnered to organize the panel, The African Descent and Contribution to Cuban Independence. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you, Marta. It's a real pleasure for me to open this session, this roundtable. The idea was originated from some work that I've been doing on early 19th century Cuban history. It's commonly understood that the exceptional raceless Cuban national identity is rooted in the 19th century wars of independence, where the struggle for abolition and the struggle for independence were combined, which put African descended and European descended Cubans together in a common fight for liberty, both from enslavement and colonial control. So the idea for this roundtable is to bring together scholars of the period, and we have three, and Marta will introduce them after I've introduced the topic, to discuss ways in which the 19th century Cubans of African descent possibly reimagined Cuban national identity and independence. We will also attend to the experiences of women, and the panel will explore how African descended slaves and free blacks rebelled prior to the First War of Independence and then later afterwards in the two wars of independence that followed. We will be asking whether it can be argued that a vision of a future raceless society might have been an aim of these insurrectionists, possibly inspired by the Haitian Revolution at the start of the century. Over to you, Marta.
Thank you, Stephen. And I do want to thank Stephen, who did really all of the heavy lifting on this panel, absolutely all the organizing. So this roundtable is due entirely to his efforts. I'm going to just give a quick introduction on our three panelists up front. And then each panelist will talk from anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes, just in terms of introductory remarks to give us some food for thought. And then we will open it up to a larger discussion. Stephen and I might ask some questions just to get the discussion going. But I think we envision it as hopefully a broad and relatively informal conversation. So our first panelist is Aisha Finch, who is an associate professor of African American Studies and Gender Studies at UCLA. And if I'm correct, currently vice chair in the Department of Gender Studies. Is that right, Aisha? She received her PhD in history from NYU. Her areas of research and teaching include comparative slavery, political and intellectual movements in Cuba, Latin America, and the African diaspora, gender ideologies in the Caribbean, and Black feminist thought. She's the author of Rethinking Slave Rebellion in Cuba, La Escalera and the Insurgencies of 1841 to 1844, and her current book manuscript, Rethinking Slave Rebellion, no, that's the same one. Sorry, I should have read this more carefully. The book explores the resistance movements and political cultures of enslaved rural Cubans during the mid-19th century. And then our second panelist is Bonnie Lucero, who is Associate Professor of History and Director of the Center for Latino Studies at the University of Houston Downtown campus. She earned her PhD in history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her research centers on the historical intersections of race and gender in colonial and post-colonial contexts, especially in Cuba. She's the author of Revolutionary Masculinity and Racial Inequality, Gendering War and Politics in Cuba, and A Cuban City Segregated, Race and Urbanization in the 19th Century. She's also co-editor of Voices of Crime, Constructing and Contesting Social Control in Modern Latin America. Her current project, tentatively titled Malthusian Practices, A History of Pregnancy, Abortion, and Infanticide in Cuba Since Colonial Times, interrogates how laws regulating women's reproduction historically perpetuated gender-specific forms of racial inequality since the 18th century. And then our third panelist, Cécile Accilien, is professor and chair of the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies at Kennesaw State University in Georgia. And prior to her current role, Cécile was director at the University of Kansas of the Institute of Haitian Studies, as well as the associate director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. Accilien's primary areas of interest include Haitian studies, gender studies, and film studies. She's the author of Rethinking Marriage in Francophone, African, and Caribbean Literatures, and she's also co-edited several collections, including Revolutionary Freedoms, A History of Survival, Strength, and Imagination in Haiti, Just Below South, Intercultural Performance in the Caribbean and the U.S. South, and Teaching Haiti Beyond Literature, Intersectionalities of History, Literature, and Culture. And her current book project is Haitian Hollywood, Recreating Home in Exile. So we will just go in the order in which I just introduced the panelists, starting with Aisha.
Okay, so good afternoon to everyone. Good evening for some folks. Thank you so much. Thank you to Stephen for convening us. I'm actually currently in the Department of Women's Studies at Emory University. And so I'll just kind of give a few opening thoughts to sort of keep some time here by way of sort of opening up the conversation. And one of the places that I think is always just so generative to begin is with Ada Ferrer's now classic book, Insurgent Cuba, right? And so, you know, Ferrer really has this emphasis on the idea of struggle, right? Struggle and sort of like contradictions and inconsistencies and conflicts, right, as the site of nation making, right? And she has this part in her introduction where she talks about where she says it was conflict, not consensus, that defined Cuba's 19th century revolution, right? And thinking about sort of all of these, you know, regional and class and racial divisions, right? Not as sort of deviations from an otherwise straight path, but she says as constitutive of the nationalist project itself. So that is kind of really generative for me, thinking about Cuban independence kind of not as a coherent and already knowable category necessarily, but rather as this kind of deeply contested process whose origin stories we also, you know, have to contest. And that for me opens up some really productive ways to think about kind of the multiple trajectories and pathways to independence, some of which were rendered invisible or later disavowed, right? And I'm particularly interested in thinking about the relationship between the project of independence and the insurgent movements organized by enslaved people during the 19th century. So kind of building from this premise of Cuban nationhood as a site of struggle, I would argue that there's kind of two ways to think about this relationship between sort of broadly speaking, slave rebellion and Cuban nationhood, which are both contradictory and convergent. So first, I mean, it's absolutely critical to situate slave insurgencies, right, as central to the emergence of an anti-colonial movement in Cuba, and even more specifically to the development of the decolonial epistemologies that shape the Cuban nation. And really grounding the story of Cuban nationalism within particular communities of African descent really shifts the ways in which we think about the temporality of anti-colonialism, right? And Fanny Rushing is one of the people who's argued for kind of thinking about this longue durée approach to thinking through the emergence of the Cuban nation, and really highlighting the ways in which enslaved and free people of color offered continuous, right, vocal, vociferous, organized critiques of Spanish colonialism and its imbrication with slavery for well over a century prior to the opening of formal independence in 1868. So this kind of characterization of Cuba as kind of la siempre fiel isla, right, or the ever faithful isle, really requires us to question, right, faithfulness from whom? And it requires us to think about a Black radical tradition that fundamentally ruptured modernity as we know it and really pushed a discourse of racelessness farther than it ever intended to go. And the ways in which, you know, thousands of enslaved and formerly enslaved Black people took that radical tradition with them onto the battlefields during 30 years of war. And some of that vision eventually manifested in the New Republic, but much of it did not, right? So at the same time, I also want to think about really the kind of the limits of thinking about slave insurgency as part of a longer trajectory of national independence, right? Or what's the dilemma in thinking about that trajectory? Because to think about slave rebellions as kind of rehearsals for independence really misses some of the profound and radical possibilities that were contained within organized slave insurgencies, right? So these were moments that were often defined by violence and militarized aggression, right, that should not be romanticized. But these were also moments that were defined by a radical vision about Black life, Black futurity, Black sovereignty, that could not be really kind of contained or cannot be contained by the teleology of the nation or the fight for independence, right? And so really thinking about, so for example, I've written a lot about the 1843 rebellions in Western Cuba, right? So the unraveling of white racial power in those moments constituted not only a profound rupture with the ethos of racialized captivity, but also a refusal of any existing scripts of rebellion, right? Including those created by insurgent leaders. So just really wanting to, you know, when we think about the 1843 rebellions, we think about these sustained practices of fugitivity, right? The blanques that were kind of the constant plague of the plantation world. You know, these practices represented Black flight from the death worlds of the plantations, flight from their gendered and sexual mandates, right? Bianca Bushman talks about this in her forthcoming work, flight from a world organized around white coloniality and racial capitalism. And as part of a larger kind of spectrum of organized slave opposition, these traditions carry a range of practices that are invariably rendered invisible, if not outright criminalized within Western nation states, right? African-Cuban spiritual practices, right, that eventually coalesced into Palamonte and Lukumi traditions, practices of care and intimacy, right, that constituted radical forms of kinship when traditional notions of family were made impossible, the range of African political traditions that effectively turned slaves into kings and queens, right? And as part of sort of the political architecture of these movements, right in the midst of the plantation. These were kind of the aspects of Black Cuban sociality that were integral to slave rebellions and marronage, and that really orient us to a concern raised by the brilliant and late political theorist Richard Eiton, who really questioned whether the nation state as a political formation can sustain Black aspirations for and conceptions of freedom. You know, and his skepticism was really echoed by the literary theorist Sybil Fisher, right, who writes, you know, in her book Modernity Disavowed, you know, she says, has this wonderful quote where she says, "What might have been lost when the culture and emancipatory politics of radical anti-slavery were finally forced into the mold of the nation state." So both of these questions kind of require us to sit with the radical cultures of Black resistance and refusal that were illegible to a nation state based on Western modes of citizenship. So I'll just sort of end there by saying, I would like to think about these questions as we kind of engage these possibilities together, right? So attending to the ways in which slave insurgencies should absolutely kind of reconstitute the genealogy of Cuban nationhood, in part by the alternative futures that they represented, but also attending to the fact that slave insurgencies represented something that could not be captured by the political ideologies of the Cuban nation, right? And really therefore constitute moments that exceed the grammar, right, of nation, nationality, independence, and so forth, right? And so one way to think through kind of a more productive coexistence maybe of these seemingly antagonistic frameworks is to think about slave rebellions as central and indeed integral to anti-colonialism and decolonial thinking, but as having kind of a more perhaps uneasy relationship to independence and the nation state, right? And as part of that, really also questioning the underlying tropes of resistance and revolution and freedom that remain unquestioned when we consider these frameworks through a lens that privileges militarism, right, and masculinity and belligerence, and what sort of gets disallowed when we privilege those frameworks. So I'll stop there because I want to create space for other folks to give comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Aisha. That was really, I'm so glad.
Bonnie, you're mute.
It says that I'm muted.
No, we can hear you.
Now I
Yeah.
hear you.
All right, so I'm good now?
Yes.
Okay, awesome, thank you. So thank you so much, Aisha. I'm so glad you started with pointing to Ara Ferrer's book, because that's an excellent starting point. And for me, I'm going to actually go the other way chronologically. So I'm going to go towards the Republic when I talk about kind of how conflict rather than consensus, as you put it, really defined the struggle for independence. And in my work, really what has been pivotal to answering that question is really centering gendered ideas and gendered ideologies. And so in my first monograph, Revolutionary Masculinity and Racial Inequality, I really, I think about how racial exclusion persisted despite nationalist discourses of racial harmony, specifically through these gendered ideologies, specifically masculinity. And many people might be wondering, after so many decades of studying Cuban independence through a masculine militarized lens, why would we study specifically masculinity? And for me, it's really important to think about men as gendered subjects in their own right, really prior to, you know, in previous scholarship, men were kind of taken for granted as this universal subject. It was an independence struggle that was really centered around what men were doing without even asking if men's experience was representative or whether it kind of reflected other people's experience. And it really wasn't until Teresa Prados Torreira's book Mambisas that we really started to actually think about are there other people involved in this anti-colonial struggle? And she makes a really great case that women were really central to that struggle in a lot of different ways, right? And so I'm kind of dialoguing with both those ideas by saying, okay, we need to think about men as gendered subjects. And by doing that, we really see kind of how Cubans of different backgrounds are attempting to negotiate and resolve the conflicts in perceptions and ideas over what independence will look like. So in my book, I take kind of a case study of Central Cuba. I'm looking specifically at the 4th Army Corps of the Independence, the Liberating Army, which is a really interesting case study because a lot of the people that fought in the 4th Corps eventually become really pivotal to national politics in the 3-4 decades after the war ends. So it's really interesting to kind of look at the backgrounds that they're coming from. And basically what I'm seeing there is that you have kind of a shifting and evolving kind of amorphous vision of masculinity that's being used and redefined at specific historical moments, specifically to adjudicate these conflicts over who's going to have the right to authority, who is going to be representative of the nation, who's going to have access to power, who's going to have access to authority. And so with that, the book kind of goes not only into the years of the war, but also into the years of the U.S. military occupation, and asking how does this political transition, this really contentious, fraught political transition, how does that again push and pull and change these ideas of masculinity so that it ultimately the dominant visions of masculinity are supporting the persistence of racial hierarchy as opposed to the challenges against it, which were really pivotal to the early imaginings of the Cuban anti-colonial struggle. So I really think that, the conflict over defining anti-colonial struggle and defining what's going to come after that, centering gender really helps us understand how Cuban men and women of different backgrounds are thinking about this and how they're negotiating it on the ground in their everyday lives, in their on the battlefield, during meals, these very everyday experiences. And so I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. And I thank you for the opportunity to be in this panel.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. Bonsoir, good evening, good afternoon. I have to say it's intimidating to be among historians. I am not a historian. I will blame Marta for whatever faux pas I make. I am a literary and cultural studies scholar, and as such, I'm entering the discussion from the perspective of cultural production. And what I will do is briefly discuss La Última Cena, the Last Supper. I know many of you are familiar with it, but I don't want to assume, so I will just briefly contextualize and put my thoughts together. And I will end with a 2 minutes and 45 second music by the Creole choir of Cuba. So the Last Supper by Thomas Gutierrez Alea is set just after the Haitian Revolution at the end of the 18th century in a sugar mill in Havana, Cuba. As we can imagine, Cuban enslavers, they are panicking and they're scared of what that Haitian Revolution means for them. So at the beginning of the film, we see the Count who return to find out that Sebastian, one of his enslaved, had run away. And the overseer, Don Manuel, cut off Sebastian's ears and fed it to the dogs to teach the other enslaved people a lesson on obedience. And what's interesting for me is the way you have this tension. The Count really sees himself as a good, pious Christian, even though the priest on the plantation is constantly telling him he needs to be a better Christian, including by letting the enslaved go to mass so that they can learn about God, because of course they don't know God because that's one of the reasons they are enslaved, because they are dark skinned and all that. So as you can imagine from the title itself, The Last Supper, the Count is reenacting the Last Supper, and he claims to see the 12 chosen, quote unquote, enslavers as the 12 disciples. And he even went as far as doing mass to kiss their feet. But of course, watching the film, we see that after he does that, he wipes off his mouth. He's drunk, and he is supposedly teaching the enslaved about Christian virtues, such as the quote-unquote joy of suffering. But he is being challenged. In fact, one of the enslaved said, "Let me see if I understand. When overseer beats me, I shall be happy." That's the translation. So while drunk, the Count promised the enslaved that they will not work on Good Friday. They'll have the day off. And when he fails to keep his promises, they revolt. So this revolt on Good Friday can be read as representing the revolt of the enslaved in Saint-Domingue. We see the tension and hypocrisy about religion. When the slave, of course, rebel, even though at this time there are laws about ensuring that the enslaved are giving a fair trial, none of that happened. Rather, it's demonstrated to others what their fate will be when they disobey their masters. And we can talk more in the Q&A, but for me, the film is an important document to demonstrate the ways in which Haitian revolutionary ideals impacted Cuban society. For instance, the plantation sugar manager, Don Gaspar, he just arrived from Saint-Domingue, and he's there, he's teaching techniques about how to grow sugar in a way that's really profitable. But at the same time, he is quite worried that because the slave owner, the enslaver, they want to get more enslaved people so that they can grow more sugar. But Don Gaspar is worried because he knows what happened in Saint-Domingue, and he's thinking, if we get to a point where there are more enslaved people than whites, this is what will happen. So you have those two tensions. On the one end, profit versus what can actually happen if there are more enslaved people than whites. But on the other end, with the count, you have the tension of his rapport with the priest, because what he's doing, of course, is raping women and making the enslaved work constantly, because he cares more about profit than saving their souls. So historian Aisha Finch just came out with a book called Slave Revolt on Screen. I don't know if you can see the Haitian Revolution in film and video. And it's a really interesting book. And what she does is, as it comes to the Last Supper, she argues, in fact, that while the Last Supper is about Cuban slavery, but it is much more about a warning of the Haitian Revolution and not an inspiration. And we can talk about that more. So for me, using the reality of slavery, the film does a good job of, I think, also connecting to Cuban society various issues that we're dealing with, including colorism and Afro-synthetic religion, issues that are very relevant at the time. I think in the Cuban imaginary, it was important to distance its struggles and independence from Haiti as a Black nation, because Haiti unapologetically rejected the notion that whites were superior. And as we all know, Jose Marti's idea of Cuban nationalism as celebrating the country's diverse heritage was in many ways problematic. Later on, I would like to come to the 20th century, because that's really the areas that I know more, to connect Haiti to Cuba. And I would like to talk about some of the ways in which Haitians were treated in Cuban sugar mills in the early part of the 20th century. But I do want to end with the ways in which Cuba and Cuban culture and Haiti are connected to the Cuban group, the Creole Choir of Cuba. So the Creole Choir of Cuba is a very interesting group, in that what they do is they celebrate their Haitian roots. You will hear them sing in Creole. The songs are passed down from their family since the 19th century. And so they really, in their different type of songs they sing, you have some songs, that are Vodou songs. And you have more and more. After 1996, they went and visited Haiti, and they started adding some contemporary aspect of Haitian culture in their music. So I'll let Stephen play about 2 or 3 music. One Marasaelu and Haiti Pukisawap Kriye, and they should be about 3 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, everyone should be able to see that, okay?
Magasa elu bagay mama bagay baba magasa elu
Thank you.
Thank you. Cécile,
yeah, and
was that in
yes,
was that in Creole? The language was it?
Yes, yes, it was in Haitian Creole. In Marasaelu, I put on the chat. In Haitian Vodou, the Marasa or the divine twins, and although they are children, they are some of the oldest Loa or spirits. So it's very powerful that they have maintained. This was a way to maintain in a very proud way the connection between Cuba and Haiti, and the Creole choir of Cuba, they too, and the US and all over the world.
So could I just ask, just out of interest, that music is something that was brought to Cuba when the Haitians were brought to Cuba in the early 19th century and has remained there, or has it been curated and excavated by the Cubans today? Is it a legacy?
So it was brought to Cuba, and through generation they have passed on, like these songs. Yeah,
that is so interesting and so fascinating, and it really connects, like you say, the 20th century with the early 19th century. That's so important, I think. Okay, well, this has been great so far. Marta, did you want to ask a question, or did you want to say anything?
I have a question maybe to get the discussion started. Thank you so much, all 3 of you. Those are incredibly rich introductory remarks, and really had me thinking a lot about this question of, okay, nation state and how the nation defines itself in relation to both questions of race and racelessness, and the early slave rebellions and their links to notions of national independence. I don't know. I'm hearing a strong buzzing from somewhere. I don't know.
Yeah, if people in the chat in the call could mute their microphones, it would probably, yeah.
Okay,
that's
thanks.
great.
Whatever happened, that helped. Thank you. So what I was thinking about, first of all, was this opening question of slave rebellions as kind of linked to independence movements, and this is not my area at all. So I'm speaking as a real novice on some of these questions, but certainly the linking of slave rebellions to independence movements, to then historically this emergent notion of sort of a raceless Cubanidad, which I think we all know is not, it's really problematic and not true, but there is this sort of national narrative today that Cuba is without, not racist, which you will then get a lot of challenges to when you're actually talking to certainly Cuban academics. And then I was thinking about Cécile's comment about Cuba's distancing itself from the Haitian Revolution, precisely because there was sort of an unapologetic refusal of white superiority, which had me thinking back to Aisha's comments about what gets lost or suppressed when, I guess, when Black resistance or Black rebellions are co-opted or absorbed into this kind of story, national story of racelessness as constitutive of the nation state. And then I was thinking about it even in a broader Caribbean context, because obviously then on the other hand, we've got, it seems on the face of it like maybe the Dominican Republic went in the opposite direction. I think I want to problematize this, but certainly the Dominican Republic was distancing itself so dramatically from Haiti to the point that it was actually embracing a Spanish identity and a white identity. And in addition, I was thinking about questions of gender and I don't know, I was thinking about Jose Marti's assertion that Cubans are in fact masculine, and therefore able to, resist Anglo, or should resist Anglo absorption, in contrast to this Anglo idea of an effeminized and raced Cuban non-whiteness. And so I just wanted to play around with these ideas of national identity, Cubanidad, responses to the Haitian Revolution, and masculinity and gender in whatever ways the panelists would like to take that nexus of questions. Was that too unwieldy?
I'll let the historian answer.
Stephen, we can't hear you.
Sorry. What I'm very interested to hear is, and it's something you said, Aisha, right at the very beginning, is that African descended people, enslaved people, rebelled for a century before 1868. Now, we're all agreed that this idea of a raceless Cubanidad actually is a kind of white dominant discourse which comes after 1868, and it's kind of formulated at the end of the 19th century by Marta in particular, who happens to be, yes, white male liberal. Now, it seemed that what interested me was the people that were rebelling before 1868 were Black people, and they were enslaved. Some weren't, some were free blacks, but they, you know, the slaves, this was a struggle against slavery, but they must have imagined whatever kind of result that if they were successful, they would be creating a new society, a new entity to live under, and that must, therefore, ipso facto, be anti-racist. They couldn't imagine they wanted to enslave white people, right? So I would imagine that they themselves would wish to live in a society where all people, regardless of race, shared the same rights, as was tried to be established by the Haitians in Haiti. You know, if you take the 1804 Constitution of Haiti, it is pretty anti-racist in my view. So is it possible to kind of argue that the origin of raceless Cubanidad is actually a black imagining, which predated the 1868? What do you think?
Well, I mean, I can sort of take a stab at this. So what I think is important is to kind of parse out the ways in which we understand racelessness, right? The ways that it was articulated by a particular kind of revolutionary elite, right? And a subsequent national elite, right? And to sort of distinguish that from the ways in which enslaved people and free people of color, right, mounted this this kind of sustained critique of racial slavery, right? And so I think, I mean, there's a couple of things to think about, you know, with the idea of racelessness, and you know, so on the one hand, right, Nada talks about this in her book, right, that it actually we have to actually think about the radical implications of this discourse, right, emerging when it did in the late 19th century, at the height of a period of biological racism, right, the nadir of U.S. postbellum race relations, right, and the ways in which racelessness has been since its inception a way to evade questions of race and racism, right? And that, I think, is really kind of the dual legacy of racelessness that we have to reckon with. Devin Spence-Benson talks about this in her excellent examination of this discourse, right, in the post-1959 revolutionary state, right? That it had this radical potential, and the ways in which it became a vehicle, right, for Black people to critique the failures of the nation to live up to that potential, right? And on the other hand, forces us to question an idea of nationhood, question the idea of a Republican nationhood that was completely divorced, right, or somehow a radical departure from these earlier systems of racial violence and dispossession. And what I would say to answer your question really specifically, Stephen, what I think is that we can root very firmly in the movements of enslaved and free people in the 19th century, right, is a particular kind of thinking, a particular kind of articulation of anti-colonialism, right, and decoloniality that was rooted in I don't know that I would say racelessness, but I would say absolutely a radical commitment to Black political sovereignty, right, to Black personhood and being, right, and to all of the, you know, kind of ideological apparatuses that were attendant to racial captivity and racial slavery. So I think that stating that they are no longer Blacks nor whites, they're only Cubans, is in and of itself a particular kind of political project, right? That is intended to is intended as a form of mobilization, of political mobilization, right? That is intended to be a discourse that structures the nation, and it does very specific political work. And I would say that the radical impulse of racelessness, right, which Black Republican activists, right, Malia Papademos talks about this, right, Takara Brunson talks about this in her beautiful new work, right, then mobilized, right, was that impulse of Black and African subjects in the 19th century to outright refuse the terms, right, and the conditions of coloniality that then made racelessness necessary as a discourse, right? So does that make sense? That's how I would kind of make that distinction, right? I think that and that's where I was sort of trying to go in my opening remarks, which is that I think that it's really critical to understand the ways in which, I mean, I think we can argue, right, that that slave rebellions effectively radicalized, right, and pushed a particular kind of nationalist discourse in a direction where it might not have originally gone, right? But I think that to me is a little bit different from situating enslaved insurgents as kind of the progenitors of racelessness, right? Which I think of as having very particular political utility, right? And very particular political aims that are rooted in the nation state and the nation state form, right? Those are my thoughts.
So what?
Steve, we can't hear you. I think you're gonna.
I'd also like to add on to that.
So go ahead, Bonnie. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to really agree with Aisha here. I think the key question is, what is the political work that racelessness does, right? And Aisha, you stated that question really well. And I think, we have to ask, who needs racelessness? Who needs it? Black people don't need racelessness. White people need racelessness, because what is the work that racelessness does? Racelessness essentially erases and eliminates and preempts the ability to talk about something that's uncomfortable for white people, and that's for white people. And that essentially, and so I have to argue that I don't see the, and I'm not an expert in that subject matter, but I don't see the slave and free people of color uprisings of the 19th century as claiming raceless. They're simply claiming humanity. They're saying, hey, I want to be treated as a person. I want basic human rights. That's not racelessness. That's see me as a person for who I am. And it's, we get racelessness when we have to figure out a way to bridge very clear and persisting realities of racial hierarchy with a joint and shared project of anti-colonialism. That's why we get racelessness. It's, in fact, in many ways, I would argue that racelessness is not revolutionary, as many people have argued, but actually very reactionary, very oppressive in a lot of ways, because you're essentially preempting any talk of what could be in terms of changes to the racial order.
Cécile, do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, for me, as I was thinking about this whole idea of racelessness, I can't help but think about the 20th and 21st century again, which is the area I know more. And there is this notion, again, by quote unquote white Cubans, and especially we all know this has been used to benefit the majority of, especially predominantly white Cubans, quote unquote, with that whiteness, to position themselves and be empowered. And we see, that tension with Haitian and Cubans in the US. And it's very interesting because we see it differently, because Cuba and Haiti at different times have a very different rapport than Cuban and Haitians in Miami, for instance. And so it's interesting, I think this whole raceless society has benefited white and continues even going into the 20th century in what it does. And it makes sense for quote unquote white Cuban as they came to the US in the 20th century and so forth to position themselves that way. It's beneficial and to get certain advantages. So we have to look at the roots, the colonial roots that still exist today of that raceless society. So that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I find this very interesting. I can see exactly what you're saying, both Aisha and Bonnie, and my approach was to think about this from the other side, if you see what I mean, that the people in Cuba who were white and wishing for independence, liberals, were split because there was a liberalism that was racialized. I mean, like the republic in the United States, it was a liberal white republic and excluded blacks. And the situation in Cuba arose that this divided white liberalism, you know, those that wished for, you know, a liberalism that included black rights were in a minority until after the American Civil War, until the latter part of the 19th century. And then you get white liberals who begin to articulate an inclusive narrative, which would let black people in. But my view is that this is kind of, like you're saying, forced upon them by the fact that the black people themselves were necessary for the project to be successful. They had to defeat the racist white liberals. And so this whole ideology of racelessness originates because of a necessity on the whites' part, but it's an absolute goal for the blacks. It has to be. I mean, when I say racelessness, not the imposition of a kind of ideology which is repressive, as you've articulated, but a society that is without racism.
I wonder if it's possible. I'm sorry, Bonnie. Go ahead.
Go ahead. I just want to.
Maybe it's possible that you and I were about to say roughly the same thing, but
yeah, I just want to make the small point that discursive racelessness is not the same as a society without racism. And in fact,
I was going to say something very similar. I was going to ask if it's possible to talk about national imaginaries that are anti-racist separately from a national imaginary or a national narrative of racelessness. And what might those national narratives, either historically or in terms of cultural production, how could we think about national narratives or national imaginaries that are anti-racist but not raceless?
Aisha, you're on mute.
Sorry. I think it's really important also to think about the way, like, racelessness as a particular kind of political strategy, right? And one of the strategies, right, was to mark, right, a particular kind of departure from the colonial regime, right, in ways that actually masked and muted and rendered inarticulable, which is to sort of limit the possibilities for talking about the ways in which the nationalist movement, Cuban independence, and the new republic were in some ways, absolutely, and in other ways were not, right? Did not represent a departure from that colonial regime, right? But needed a rhetoric to make it clear to, you know, sort of a range of people who you know, they need to buy in, for lack of a better way of putting it, right? Sort of a particular kind of nationalist project. So yeah, I think the points that Bonnie was making about sort of like who exactly needs racelessness, right? And literally up until this contemporary moment, and the ways in which that has been invoked actually to silence Black dissidents, to as a sort of as a repressive mechanism to eliminate kind of vocal critiques of racism and anti-Black violence, right? That is really kind of the evolution of racelessness that I think we need to keep central. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think, you know, it maybe draws attention to it a little bit more if we acknowledge that the raceless national identity that emerges in the mid 19th century, you know, 1868 and onward, is not the first iteration of Cuban national identity. I mean, earlier 19th century nationalist projects were explicitly racist, explicitly anti-Black. I mean, if we look at, you know, the 18 teens, for example, and Jose Antonio Sacco, thank you, is talking about, you know, a Cuban national identity that is explicitly white, and to achieve that, we need to stop the slave trade. Like, we need to literally control the demographic trajectory of the island in order to produce this white population so that we can have a white national identity. And so many others agreed with this, maybe not by specifically ending the slave trade. That was a little bit controversial because many people benefited from that, of course. But this idea that whiteness was so key and so central to even the possibility of Cuba having a national identity. And we see that again, for example, in the colonization projects throughout the 19th century that continue really all the way through the 19th century. Even as we're talking about a raceless national identity, we're still literally paying people from Europe to please settle in Cuba so we can whiten the population. That's wild. I mean, think about that. That's really not a raceless national identity at all. That's a specifically and explicitly white national identity. It's an idea that premises the existence of a national community on whiteness. And this kind of foundation really doesn't disappear with the emergence of raceless rhetoric, right? We still have the notion of the universal human/male subject as implicitly white. It's not acknowledged, right? Jose Marti would deny it, and he would say, oh no, we're not white, we're not Black, we're not mulatto, we're not anything. But if you were to ask Cuban men of his day, what does a Cuban man look like? Who would they imagine? They would imagine somebody who looks like Jose Marti, a white man.
And to your point, so yeah, there's an echo and I couldn't hear if you were talking. I apologize, Bonnie.
Please go ahead, Cécile.
Okay, yeah, no, so what I was saying to your point, looking back at the Last Supper, there's this moment in which the Count say vehemently, this is not Saint-Domingue. You know, the idea like this could never happen. And interestingly, the runaway enslaved person, Sebastian, he is shown as not having the virtue because he practices Afro-synthetic religion. He has not bought into, you know, white Catholicism, and this is why he runs away, because he doesn't understand his place in regard to whiteness and his problematic, of course. Yeah.
I'm just wondering
I
if there are...
also just wanted, oh, no, I just wanted to sort of add to, you know, this discussion with this list that Bonnie was making, right? Like Domingo del Monte, right? Francisco de Valle Gonzalez, right? Like this list, right, of the fathers of the nation, right? So the early fathers of the nation, you know, in 1844, our 1840s, I should say, you know, having discussions, right, about an independence movement and actively trying to figure out, right, like sort of like actively discussing how to do this without Black people, right? How to do this, more to the point, how to do this while still maintaining slavery, how to do this while sort of attending to the fragility of white slaveholders, sort of the original white fragility, right? And you know, and actually stating things like, you know, we have to make sure that this does not turn into, you know, a Black republic. And so just wanted to kind of add to that point and to the kind of the deepening of this, I mean, and it's a tension, right? Because on the one hand, you have this idea that you know, slavery and anti-colonialism have, you know, anti-slavery, I should say, maybe that was an interesting split, but anti-slavery and anti-colonialism have long been yoked, right? Have long been interconnected, right, in Cuban nationalist thinking. But it is possible for that to be the case, right? And to still have that version of anti-colonialism based on anti-Blackness, right? Which then gives rise to, you know, the forms of racelessness that we've been talking about.
And so to go back to one of your original questions, Aisha, which is what do we lose? What is lost when moments of Black resistance or refusal get co-opted, get absorbed into this national narrative? And I wonder if we can extend those questions to the 20th and 21st centuries and to current Cuban cultural representation or political protest. What continues to be lost if what continues to be lost or repressed in these notions of Cuban racelessness?
Does our cultural critic Cécile want to take that one?
Yeah. So I was thinking, for instance, even when we hear of representation, we don't take, and it's not just in Cuba, it's in other places in Latin America, we don't talk about how Haiti provided financial and military assistance. So we lost that humanity of exchanges between these different nations, and how there was an aspect of wanting to support one another through the road for freedom. So we have that, and as we all know, it has and continue to create and has real impact and ramifications in our current contemporary society. As I mentioned before, relationships between Cubans in the US versus Cuban and Cuba and Haiti is very different. After the earthquake, Cuba was the first country to have sent doctors, dispatched medical doctors to Haiti. We don't even hear about that in the US. And I know such thing because I listen to, the non-US news. Most people don't know that there has been exchange where Cuba sent medical doctors to Haiti and trained medical doctors, over 400 medical doctors, every year, and now more and more with film, the Institute of Film Studies. They are very interesting cultural exchange that we don't think about. So that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, the other question that occurs to me though is that if you're talking about the project, the Cuban national project, which is articulated in the later 20th century by the revolution, Fidel Castro's, etc. What you have though is, despite the, let's say, oppressive nature of the raceless discourse, that Black and African descended Cubans support overwhelmingly the revolutionary project. And so the question has to arise as to, you know, why they do, if the raceless ideology is somehow an oppressive one. And my answer to that is, again, it goes back to what you were kind of articulating, Aisha, I think, and I think this is how I understand it, is I think that the discourse of racelessness is a kind of response to the demands that Black and African descended people are making upon the state. That this is the way they are accommodated. And there's a kind of a trade-off, I guess, that there is a patience that is apparent in the African descended population of Cuba, which is still waiting for that thing, their rightful share, as Arlene Helg put it. They are patiently still waiting for this imagined non-racist, let's say raceless, not raceless, but non-racist state to come into being. And they are seeing this project as incomplete, unsatisfactory, but they're going to stick with it because the alternative is something that is worse. And this state does express itself in an anti-racist manner, as in the support that is sent to Haiti, the support that went to South Africa, you know, the struggle, anti-colonial struggle in Black Africa in the 80s. I mean, there are manifestations of a very much more progressive kind of national project than is implied by this critique of racelessness that which I don't disagree with, that we've I don't know what you think to that.
Can I make a small comment, which is that I think, well, two comments, I think. Number one, I think racelessness is not the only political agenda item that I think Cubans of African descent are paying attention to. I think when we think about the revolution, think about what all the revolution promised. The revolution doesn't really even initially talk about race. They're talking really more about economic inequality. And economic inequality, if we're, you know, creating programs to address economic inequality, that will benefit the most impoverished people, which, because of the legacies of slavery and racist colonialism, happen to be people of African descent. And that's what happened. And I think to go to my second point, I don't think that it's reasonable to assume that people of African descent at any point in history are actually believing wholesale that what, you know, their compatriots in arms are saying, that we're going to build this raceless republic, and, you know, we're all going to be brothers and everything's going to be just, you know, beautiful. I can't imagine that they're actually believing that this is going to be true. Like, they may be thinking, oh, well, this is, you know, I can use this political discourse. I can make claims on this, you know, basis. But do they really think that from one day to night is going to be solving centuries of slavery and racist oppression? I don't think we can really pretend that they're that naive. And so I think that they realize that it's, you know, maybe a potential tool that they can use to make claims to kinds of maybe rights and authority or kind of positions or whatever else that they may want, while still recognizing that it comes with other challenges, some of which they know, some of which they are yet to find out in their lives, and that the struggle is ongoing, right? I don't know, maybe that's a cynical view of it.
No, it's realistic and pragmatic.
I'm just wondering if there are anybody on the call that wants to ask a question.
I just wanted to say really quickly that I would really agree with that assessment, and without trying to speak for Black Cubans, you know, I would never presume to be able to do that, but I think that some of the recent work that has been done, again, by folks like Benson, right, has really illuminated what Bonnie is talking about, which is this idea of really grappling with the political possibilities that are at their disposal, right? And really recognizing, like being very clear and very savvy and very cognizant, right, of the gaps, the pitfalls, right, and the fundamental ways in which race still structures Cuban governance and, you know, their everyday lives, right? And you know, at the same time, and kind of recognizing, particularly in the aftermath of the revolution, right, sort of this rejecting this false divide, right, between sort of like this kind of very, you know, narrow embrace of Blackness, and then sort of the implication that in order to fully participate in the new nation, in the revolutionary state, right, then you would have to discard that Blackness, right? So I think people have, you know, going back to the 19th century, have been, are just very, have been and remain very clear and very cognizant and very savvy about race, right, and whiteness and what it's capable of, and what the nation has not been able to provide, right? There's a historical memory there, right? There's an institutional memory there. There's, you know, people have their lived experiences. So anyway, Bonnie really kind of touched on a lot of this already, but I just wanted to underscore that.
Thank you so much. Is there anyone on the call that wants to ask a question? Don't be shy. No, well, I've got to say, I found it to be a really fascinating and very useful conversation for me.
Stephen, can I ask a question?
Yes,
or
of course.
To direct to one of the questions that we had kind of talked about, could we talk just really explicitly about gender and sexuality, and just sort of thoughts about how that's kind of shaping this larger conversation?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
So, I want to, Cécile, did you want to speak to this? I want to make sure that your voice is amplified here.
Oh, no, thank you. No, you can start.
Well, so one of the questions that for everyone watching, right, that Stephen had asked us to think about, and that Bonnie specifically, right, had asked us to think about, right, was just being really attentive to the ways in which discourses of gender and sexuality really shape the larger conversation that we're having about kind of the emergence of you know, ideas around Cuban independence, you know, et cetera. And I think that I mean, one of the things that I wanted to say is that so when we center women as historical actors, right, when we think about questions of gender and sexuality, it gives us a different way to think about what constitutes a movement for independence, what constitutes an anti-colonial struggle, what constitutes a movement of nation building, right? And Bonnie kind of touched on this in some of her opening remarks. And I just wanted to really kind of hone in on the kind of social and immaterial and reproductive labor, right, of Black Cuban women in particular, that necessarily was an integral part of this kind of long struggle for independence. But then all that gender labor really becomes invisibilized when we think about when histories get written of national political movements, right? And there's so this incredible amount of our attention recently, I should say, has been paid to Mariana Grajales, for example. Mariana Grajales, right, the mother of Antonio Maceo. And people really become enamored kind of with the stories of her bravery and how, you know, she accompanied rebel troops and kind of urged her sons into battle. And one of the things that gets, you know, much less frequently highlighted is the kind of daily, thankless, consistent care labor that she performed, right? Taking care of the sick and dying and working provision grounds and all of these kinds of things. And moreover, the ways in which she was critical to shaping the racial consciousness and the political awareness of Maceo and her other children, right, who then became central figures in the war for independence. So kind of thinking about, these are just a few examples, right, of the ways in which centering gender as an analytic kind of requires us to think in very different terms about the emergence of the nation, right? Thinking about what constitutes an anti-colonial geography, right? Thinking about the kitchen, right? The patio as a site where political work takes place, right? Thinking about the reproductive labor of enslaved women, right? As central to, you know, kind of this making of the new nation, right? Sort of like all the ways in which, you know, enslaved people of all genders and their illicit desires, right? Stories of queer life get invisibilized in these narratives. So I just wanted to kind of explicitly speak to that question a little bit, because I think it's so important.
Yeah.
And to your points, oh, sorry, Bonnie. Go ahead, Bonnie.
Please, after you.
Thank you. No, I was just going to say, as you were talking, Aisha, I'm thinking specifically of the space of religious spaces. I'm thinking of Afro-syncretic religious, the roles that women play, you know, whether to bring herbs during the ceremony, and how that really helped the enslaved. And I'm thinking even Maroons. I mean, it's fairly recently, you know, my knowledge is focused on Haiti and other French-speaking islands, that we start thinking about the place of women in helping runaway enslaved people and the Maroon community. So yeah, that's what I was thinking about.
Yeah, I'd like to add two things. Number one is I think to think about kind of how considering, you know, gender and sexuality structurally impacts kind of how we understand anti-colonial struggle. I want to point out that it's maybe no coincidence that anti-slavery and anti-colonial struggle coincide at precisely the moment that the slave trade to Cuba is ending. The last recorded slave voyage to enter Cuban shores was 1867. So this is literally months before the uprising in 1868 in October. And that's not a coincidence, right? It's not a coincidence that, you know, the realization that they couldn't get any more African captives imported into the island. And they had to come to terms with what they had been struggling with for over a century, was the fact that they could not get enslaved women to do what they wanted them to do, which was reproduce slavery on the island. And that realization that they could not have a self-sustaining slave population, specifically because they could not control in these specific ways enslaved women, this is kind of really what contributed to many slave owners saying, well, okay, I guess slavery is kind of over for us. We don't really have, even though it lasted a couple more decades after that, right? It was really falling apart, especially in the eastern provinces where there was less investment from the United States and other places, right? And so that piece of kind of recognizing, you know, the role of women, enslaved women in particular, and their reproduction, their bodily autonomy, kind of the ways they kind of staked out a claim for, you know, their own lives and their families, really impacted the course of Cuban history, Cuban independence and Cuban abolition. And the second point that I want to make is that in a lot of ways, I found in my research on the final War of Independence, I found that women were kind of, I don't want to say it like this, but they were very instrumental to men's negotiations vis-a-vis other Cuban men. So I'm thinking specifically of something that both I and Ara Ferrer wrote about, which is the case of Quintín Bandera, who was accused of majacería, or being, you know, a lazy, bad Cuban soldier, because he was alleged to have a lover in battle. And it's really interesting to think about these allegations about having a lover, because this was literally the practice of every white Cuban officer, like, ever. This was like what they did. You know, this is what officer status got you. It got you access to women, in addition to access to better food and things like that. But the fact that it was so wildly unacceptable for a dark-skinned Black man to claim the same privileges as many white officers kind of enjoyed on a regular basis, with nobody even batting an eye, is really, I mean, that really underscores kind of the intersections of race and gender, and just how pivotal not only women, but also attitudes about sexuality, hypersexuality, the racialized hypersexuality that we often find is ascribed to people of African descent, and specifically about, you know, racialized attitudes of masculinity. And so we also see it in a lot of other iterations involving women, like how we frame donations, right? So there was groups of Cuban women, you know, working manufacturing clothing and other supplies and provisions, and gathering donations for the Cuban troops. And who got access to those donations? Not necessarily the people that needed them most, but the people who were perceived to need these status bumps that would align their appearance with their social status, their pre-war social status. And so a lot of the clothing that was manufactured by these donation groups went to prominent white officers, and they weren't labeled as charity. They weren't. They were labeled as, these are provisions, right? But if there was ever any provisions that went to Black officers, say Jose Gonzalez Planas, who complained repeatedly about being denied basic supplies for his troops, it was said that he was whining, he was complaining, he was just wanting charity, he was just wanting things that he didn't need, right? So the framings that we have of these things kind of emphasizing and accentuating the masculinity of prominent white officers while denigrating Black officers for literally the same behavior. So I'll just end there.
Terrific. Thank you. It's now, well, back here in England, it's 10:20. So I don't know whether we have any questions from those that are listening in. Some people are already leaving, so maybe it's time to wrap it up. Marta, what do you say? I found this to be terrifically rewarding conversation, and you know, from my part, I want to thank Aisha, Bonnie, and Cécile for their help, and LASA for making it possible to do this. There will be a recording, and it will be on the International Institute for the Study of Cuba's YouTube site tomorrow, and I will forward one to all parties in this conversation, and LASA will probably be able to make one available through its system as well. Marta, do you want to say anything?
I want to express a deep note of gratitude to our panelists. Really, just a wonderfully rich discussion. Thank you all. Thank you so much for the conversation. It's been fabulous. And thanks to Steve for putting it all together, because it really was he pulling the heavy lifting.
Thank you, guys. So with that, I guess we'll say goodbye. And hopefully we'll meet in a few months' time, either virtually or together in San Francisco at the LASA Congress.
Bye all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bonnie,
Oh my God. Hi. How are
I
you?
was like, I was listening to you. I don't know if we're still recording. Have we stopped recording?
No, I stopped.